Hello, welcome to the YouTube, Facebook workshops. Our topic today: how can I invite my partner to be vulnerable? And this is a question that I get a lot, and it came up quite a bit in our Valentine's Day workshop last month. I also get asked a lot, for that matter, how can I be more vulnerable with my partner? But today, I wanted to actually focus on the first question: the vulnerability of our partner. So you might remember in last month's workshop that we all joined in an exercise where we wrote a letter to a loved one and we based it on a few prompts. How have you been changed by knowing this person? How do you enhance this person's life? How would you like your relationship to grow or to change over the next year? And after you wrote the letters, so many of you asked me, I mean, you asked me after you wrote the letters, but I think you probably even thought of it, some of you, while you were writing the letter. How do I get my partner to do this for me? How could I ever get my partner to do this for me? And I just thought this is the topic of our next meeting, our next gathering. Questions around inviting vulnerability come up all the time in my work with couples. And a common dynamic I see is one partner who openly shares their feelings, the light ones and the dark ones, and who complains that their partner won't share in the same way. Why won't you talk to me? You should be able to tell me anything. Don't you trust me? I'm an open book and you are a vault. And depending on the tone of and the intention of these statements, they can be registered sometimes as an invitation, but often as a longing, as a complaint, as a criticism. It's all about the context. But for them, emotion speak is the expression of intimacy, and they experience their partner's silence as avoidance, rejection, distrust, and distance. Our definition of intimacy today in the West, for sure, is about sharing feelings. We connect vulnerability with intimacy. We connect it with the sharing of our fears, wishes, aspirations, insecurities to a caring, listening, and validating partner who will acknowledge us and empathize with us. And all of us citizens of this modern cultures have bought into the idea that intimacy is a communicative experience in which we all share with each other our most intimate possessions, our internal life. Intimacy in this culture often goes with into me see. And that's quite different from the historical definition of intimacy or the broad range of cultural definitions of intimacy. For many of us, by the way, that's our parents, our grandparents, our aunts and uncles, for whom that kind of talking is anything considered intimacy. It's the living together, it's the working the lands, it's cooking together, it's raising the children, it's sharing bank accounts, it's the sharing of the burdens of the everyday life that is considered intimacy. So it's not just far-fetched in history. Many of us live in a cross-cultural dialogue with the values in which we grew up when it comes to sharing of vulnerability and our definitions of intimacy. But definitely, wherever people have become more alone, intimacy has focused more on the sharing of the internal life as a way to bridge that sense of aloneness and to connect with others. And just because we've opted in this relational culture, it doesn't mean that our partner experiences it the same way as we do. Revealing our vulnerabilities creates trust, but trust also is the condition from which vulnerability grows. So it's a both ways, right? Revealing our vulnerabilities create trust, and trust also grows, and vulnerability also grows out of the trust. And we create trust in all kinds of ways, not just by talking about our innermost thoughts and feelings. So today, I'm here to tell you a hard truth. Some of you have come to expect that from me, so I'm happy to deliver. While we can invite someone to be vulnerable with us, we cannot force them. And while we can ask for an invitation into our partner's inner life, and we can ask what's on your mind, what are you thinking, what are you feeling, we cannot demand admittance. Much as it hurts, we are not entitled to unrestricted access into the private thoughts of our loved ones. We would love it sometimes, some of us, but it is not a given. Vulnerability in a romantic relationship is a gift, not a given. I'm going to repeat that one. Vulnerability in a romantic relationship is a gift, not a given. So, we'll get to all of that in a moment, but first, housekeeping. Again, hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for Letters from Esther Live, my monthly workshop that helps you reflect, act, and develop greater confidence and relational intelligence in all your relationships. This series happens monthly on YouTube and Facebook Live. And for more Letters from Esther, go ahead, visit estherperel.com/blog. And I invite you to join me every month here on YouTube or Facebook to discuss the newsletter live. So you read it, you think about it, you process it, you come back, you join me, we talk about it, and you get to ask me questions, and I get to respond more personally and more directly to you. And before we start, consider reaching out to somebody else, any other person that you think this one should be here right now, hearing this. This is for you. So go ahead and reach out to them. And of course, you know me, I encourage you to take notes, notebook, laptop, wherever you want. But it's so important to write those things down. It helps us remember, it helps us anchor these things. And if you like what you learned today, please go ahead, like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. It just makes me so happy. And you can find all the buttons that you need below. Let's start with where it usually needs to start, which is a good definition, a working definition for us, for our conversation for today. What is vulnerability? Because we can talk about the vulnerability as a social position that people have in a society. I'm going to talk about a very particular way of looking at vulnerability, and I'm going to borrow from my friend and colleague, Brene Brown. And she says, vulnerability, quote, uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. That unstable feeling that we get when we step out of our comfort zone into something that forces us to loosen control. I want to build on this definition. If we want our partner to be vulnerable with us, we have to accept that true vulnerability is not a mandate. It's a possible outcome that grows out of closeness, risk, and trust. And there's more than one way to develop that. Being vulnerable means being in a position where other people can hurt us. Being vulnerable means you can judge me, you can ridicule me, you can reject me. It often is based on my revealing the parts of myself upon which I have the least confidence or certainty, and then allowing you to respond to me. So, the thing I want to focus on today is that the concept of inviting vulnerability often tends to focus way more on the latter word, vulnerability, and not enough on the former one, inviting. So I'm going to focus in a little more on the invitation itself. Inviting is a word that gives us a practical path to the thing that we want most, intimacy. But it also carries the most risk, because an invitation comes with expectations. And expectations sometimes are frustrations in the making. And an invitation can yield a possible refusal or a rejection or an ambivalence. Basically, it's not just because I say, how do you feel, that I'm going to get a whole expose. And that is the word, exposed and expose. Any expectation can be a frustration in the making. So we all have friends that have never invited us to come into their homes. I mean, I know where I live that the home is not the first place people come. The physical home or the emotional home for that matter. And when I say I work in a place or I live in a place, it's not just the city I live in, it's also in my own office. People often come to my office in order to learn to invite people into their inner home, in order to become more comfortable to go visit other people in their inner home. We all have friends who sometimes cancel at the last minute. You thought you were going to see them, you thought you were going to hear from them, and then nothing. But we also have friends that show up. We've had all of these experiences. And this applies not just to friends, but family, partners, lovers, people we are in close relationships with. And when we extend an invitation to someone, we also have to acknowledge the power that comes with their freedom of choice. Sorry, I can't come today. Sorry, this is not a good time. I really would like to, but I'm not sure I can. Or I'm not sure I want to. And people can say this with words or in all kinds of ways. You hear it instantly. Yeah, let me look at my calendar. Let me see if there's an option, rather than I would love this. This is such a wonderful invitation. You know right away how the invitation lands. When we ask, will you join me? They can say yes, no, maybe, another time. And while most of us think that we want close connections, we resist vulnerability. It's this real tug between these two. The very trait that makes the connection possible is the very trait that is most challenging for us to engage in. It's like you can't without, but it's very scary sometimes with. And in a culture that often praises having thick skin or staying strong or self contained, we often, of course, mistakenly brush off being vulnerable as weak. So there's loads of reasons for avoiding being vulnerable, but particularly it has to do with our unique and specific experiences, and often the ones in early life. Every kid is a keen observer. And we sat there with the people who were meant to care for us, and we watched them respond to each other. And we saw if there was care or kindness or compassion or empathy, or if there was criticism or humiliation or shaming. We watched what people did with the precious, tender, vulnerable, insecure parts that the other was grappling with. And then we watched what was done with us, how people responded to us. Those that mattered, not just people, our caregivers, whoever the people were that were teaching us how to love others and ourselves. And we are students of these patterns of relationships. So if we had a rejecting or a neglectful parent, we may see ourselves as a burden or an intrusion. Basically, we learn to walk on eggshells. We learn to protect ourselves is the essence of this. We learned what to do and what not to do in order to avoid the situations that often made us cringe or that were so painful to witness. And we thought either if I have a person that explodes next to me or that is critical or flies off the handle, I'm going to keep myself very tamed. And if I have a person who may not pay attention, then I'm not going to call for their attention because I know that I'm not going to get it. Says the protective part of us that says, I'm not going to let you get hurt over and over again. So, how our partners respond to us, of course, has a lot to do with the intricacies of their emotional history. But also, we can never underestimate or overestimate how much the way we invite will shape the way that the other person responds. Yeah, it is relational. So, what are some of the things that we can do that massage the invitation, right? One is not to pressure, it's an invitation. So if you get a no, not now, maybe, you allow for that and you don't start pressuring. And sometimes we pressure because we ourselves are feeling uncomfortable with our own vulnerability. So I shared mine, now you share yours. Don't leave me out there alone in the cold. So an invitation is an invitation. We try not to pressure, and we try as best we can to respond kindly and with reassurance that is no judgment or no ridicule or no rejection. And it has a lot to do with how we interpret the ways that our partners express their connection to us and how they choose to build closeness. Because sometimes, because I talk to you, I expect, and that makes me feel close, I expect that you would feel close to me if you talk to me, when in fact, I may feel closer to you if you talk to me. That's not the same, right? We tend to do with the other that which we would want them to do with us, but it isn't necessarily what they want or need. So, the nice things that our partner does for us, all these alternative little gestures that don't have to do with sharing feelings or, insecure parts of us, sharing of projects in a spirit of collaboration, that too can be a vulnerable act. A priceless smile, a well timed wink that expresses complicity and attunement, especially when words are unavailable, that too can feel very vulnerable. And there's a reason why 30 years later, Gary Chapman's book of the 5 love languages is still so powerful for determining how we love, how we like to give, and how we receive. Okay, now I've done this intro. I want to do a little exercise with you. And I really like to ask kaleidoscopic questions, right? So that we can look at vulnerability in your relationships from multiple angles. So I'm going to give you a bunch of questions, and you're not going to answer them all now. You just can take a shot of them so you have them and you can ponder them at another moment. And right now, maybe we're going to just address the first two. What is a vulnerability that you grapple with? That you grapple with, the vulnerability you grapple with. What would you say is a vulnerability that your partner grapples with? And if you don't have a current partner, it may be a partner that you had recently or long or before, or a close person to you. Use it. It doesn't have to just be because you are currently in a romantic relationship. How would you describe your relationship to that vulnerability that they grapple with? I love that question. What's your relationship to the vulnerability that your partner struggles with? And has your response been supportive or has it been somewhat unhelpful? What's a vulnerability that used to be hard to talk about for you? And what's a vulnerability that has been central to the development of your own self acceptance? Which one did you have to learn to live with fundamentally, a different relationship to your own vulnerability? And, these are not easy questions to answer. They're not like, but though you may have very quick answers, but sometimes for many of us, the very act of answering these questions is in itself vulnerable. And we really need to make room for that rather than pressure it, you should, why don't you kind of thing. And I recently asked my own community these very questions, and I want to share with you some of the answers. And while I read, you feel free to share in the chat box your own answers. And then I'm going to look at those and we're going to start our conversation. Start sending in your questions actually as well. My team is looking at them very carefully and we're going to try to respond as many of them as I can. But here's the interesting thing. For the self, my own vulnerabilities, 61% of people that responded struggled to be vulnerable in their relationships. Vulnerabilities that our audience grappled with had to do with mental health and inner darkness and fear of failure and body image. I'm going to read you a few of the sentences. Having my darkness seen. I feel vulnerable about my potential partner not loving me the same way that I love them. Fear of abandonment. Balancing what I need from my partner versus what I need to give myself. Mental health, because he thinks that mental health struggles are just excuses. Very powerful. Failure. I don't want to be bad at something like singing or dancing in front of my partner. Expressing my needs and love for my partner, too much bottled up out of a fear of rejection. Sexual intimacy, asking for help. Hard for me to express anger, upset toward my partner. I fear conflict. My partner had an affair makes me feel unworthy and powerless, letting down my guard down, my own body image, confronting issues, how afraid I am that I won't be able to prepare our kids for the world that we live in. This is power, relying on physical affection from my partner. Basically, when I have a need and that need may not be met, that in itself was vulnerable. Okay, and being less than my partner, less intelligent, less funny, less financially independent. If I'm vulnerable, the other person will hold it against me. That's another big one. So those were really recurrent answers. But if 61% of people felt vulnerable about themselves, 79% of responders wished that their partners were more vulnerable. Very interesting. And the vulnerabilities that people saw from the partner, you know, discussing sex, being honest about small embarrassments, asking for help, things that we would want from our partner, trying new things in front of others that are outside of his character, not being where he would be ideally at this age, vulnerabilities that my partner grapples with, emotionally handicapped and he admits it, accepting her flaws and feminine soft side, sex, shame, anxiety, personal struggles, not showing feelings and not saying what she, he, they think, sharing sadness and not pretending that everything is okay when it's so obviously clear that they are not. So many. Okay. My husband hides his failures from his parents at the expense of our relationship. My primary partner wishes me to be monogamous and it's causing tension in our relationship. I ruined trust. Can't say to me what they want. It's always the same thing. I can't say what I think, what I want, what I need. My partner struggles to say what they think, what they want, what they need. And then the question is why? Did they learn to, walk on eggshells, or did they learn not to be a burden? Which is two sides from the same coin. I think that's really important to understand. It's two coping responses, but they ultimately manifest in the same behavior. So, here are some things that I would like to advise, because it's clear that vulnerability is something that we all grapple with. Some of us are more comfortable, but I wouldn't think that this is an easy thing for everybody. If we want to invite vulnerability, if we want to allow for deep, intimate bonds to live and breathe in our relationships, we have to take on the risks that come with an invitation. So, write your love letter, literally or metaphorically, and give it to them. Invite them to read it. Let go of the expectation that they will write one back. It's what you want to say to them. I would almost say let's go of any expectation for a moment. What can happen when we allow someone to experience our love how they choose, to express it in their own language without the pressure of identical reciprocation? The answer may actually surprise you. Love itself is vulnerable. Love itself is vulnerable. And it comes with a host of fears about loss, inadequacy, rejection, inequality. I love you more, you love me more. I could live without you less than you could live without me. When we open our hearts, by definition, we will be vulnerable, even without a word being spoken. I think that is something we really need to remember. And the strange expectation that we carry that once we find love, we will no longer be vulnerable to any of these things is a bit naive. It's part of the myth of romance. When you love, you feel vulnerable, and you will continue to feel vulnerable because every time you get closer, deeper, more intimate, it will require more trust, more vulnerability, more vulnerability, more risk, more risk, more trust, more trust, more risk, around and around. And love doesn't eliminate our vulnerabilities, it gives us a safe space, a healthy ecology to experience them without too much panic or embarrassment. So now I'm going to go read some of the things you told me. Ooh, It's very difficult for me to admit I love somebody. It's already difficult to admit it to myself. Can I write a letter to my ex? Yes, of course you can write, Kitty, you can write a letter to your ex, asking for what I need, truly with boundaries. Happy to chat about this. Thank you. Rob, nice, Rob. You also answered, Kitty. That's a good. I love it when you all start talking to each other as well. So, we can all be there for each other. My ex had problems with past relationships, afraid of being hurt. He wants to be vulnerable, but he's super avoidant. I don't want to push, but maybe I should because I don't before. Schwer mit einem Mann über Gefühle zu sprechen. Der Mann kriegt als Frau das Gefühl, die möchte nicht. Yes, it's hard for me. Yes, to speak with a man about feelings. Yes. I love it when you write to me in other languages too. Feel free. Trusting my decision making problem. Yes. It's been so start posting your questions to people, really. It's been a tough, long divorce, and now in a relationship that seems impossible to handle. I'm done, but I'm afraid to be single again. You always seem to hit the you need you want me to come to Cape Town? I wouldn't mind. Fearing things they learn about me could be weaponized. Yes, that is a major one, But the question is the fear that it will be weaponized born out of the relationship that you are currently in? Because you've done it and then this is what happened? Or is this a fear that you bring with you to the relationship? And therefore you anticipate something, and therefore you are reluctant to do something. But in fact, this belongs to a past and is not part of your present. It's part of what lives inside of you, but it is not in your relationship. And the only way you will know is by trying it out. Why didn't I'm afraid that my spouse married a lemon. He became a caregiver and 20 years later has resentments. My partner grapples with asking for simple, loving gestures of affection. Yes. It's very interesting. You go to somebody and you say, "Can I hug you?" It looks like you really need a hug at this moment, and then you just say, "Oh, you know, you found a way to let me know. You found a way to ask without having to ask. I'm happy to be your interpreter." And you just play with it. And then slowly you say, the next time, just can you do a little sign like this? Then I know that, it's time for a hug. It's time for affection. It's time for a cuddle. And the next question is, do you know when you need it? Because some people have so disconnected from themselves in order to maintain their attachments that they actually don't know when they need. You see, there is those of us who know but don't know how to express, but then there is those of us who sometimes don't even know. Vulnerability is like gravity. We think these things weigh us down. They actually hold us up. My sexuality has been a vulnerability for my lifetime. But the more I celebrate it, the more I rise. Yes, Stefan, very nice. My date is scared. I give him time and not too many questions. Is that the best way to let him save? Yes. It's you give time, but you can also have just gentle, inquisitive thinkings. The questions. From 1 to 10, how much would you say you're comfortable with more personal conversations? And what is some of the things that actually really make you feel comfortable in relationships to other people? Have you ever had difficult experiences when you did open up? Have you ever had experiences when you opened up that just really surprised you? It's probably even a better one early on, I would say. So you're not saying you don't open up, you seem to be screwed. You just say, have you ever had experiences? Or what have been some of your experiences where you opened up even a bit and you were surprised? What kind of surprises did you have? Now, opening up may just for some people be small things, and you think, but that's nothing. You just ask for somebody to help you switch a tire, for some people that is a lot. So what feels big to somebody doesn't need to be compared with how it feels small to you. That's in the vulnerability scale. I moved to be with my partner and experience isolation and loss of self. So one vulnerability is that, it's not one, it's probably one of the main ones in relationships, is when you go back and forth. If I attend to you, how do I stay connected to me? If I attend to me, how do I stay connected to you? Attachment and authenticity is the way that Gabor Mate looks at these fundamental sets of human need. I call it connection and separateness, but it's the same. It's how do we not fear losing ourselves, and how do we not fear losing our bonds? And it is one of the essential challenges in relationships. And for some of us, many of us, this feels very vulnerable because it sometimes feels like an either or. It's one of the most difficult things to negotiate and to navigate. Um, yeah, I was married to someone who didn't like feeling this vulnerable. I think he was so identified with his role that he closed off the parts of a partner. So that's an important piece here, is that when you are with someone, sometimes you have somebody who does not open up in this way, but they are more than happy to let you. In fact, they kind of vicariously experience it through you. You articulate your feelings, and it's often their feelings too. But sometimes you have people who are really uncomfortable. And because I'm uncomfortable with it, I don't really tolerate when you do open up. I don't tolerate when you cry. I don't tolerate when you feel scared. I don't tolerate when you feel fragile. I don't tolerate when you're unsure, because I can't tolerate these feelings inside of me. And this is when we ambush vulnerability. I won't allow it in you because I can't allow it in me. I think it's such an important piece. And that is, it sometimes requires saying, look, I understand this isn't comfortable for you, but I can live with my own. What happens is that we then often want our partner to acknowledge them and to not shut us down. And that's when a whole escalation starts. So the first thing is, does our partner acknowledge that? I cannot let you be in those states because it's uncomfortable for me, and it's uncomfortable for me because I don't recognize and don't like those feelings inside myself. So let alone see you in those states. And I don't know what to do about it is the next thing. I freeze. I don't know what to say because I have never really practiced what I would say with my own. Oh, so many, so many. Have you talked about the difference between transparency and vulnerability? No. Great question, Anthony. Vulnerability, in the way that we are now defining it, involves transparency. I mean, exposure, self revelation, disclosure, sharing of one's intimate thoughts or feelings, intimate as in deeply personal and private, is a form of transparency. I think the question that often exists around vulnerability is how much? What should be shared? And because I've said to you, vulnerability in relationship is a gift and not a given, I often add another sentence to this, which is a way that I start many of the therapies. I said, everything can be said, nothing must be said. I give you the free choice to decide when, what, and how. I don't know if you've come here because you want to learn to open up more, or because you want to learn to actually keep some of things for yourself. What is the boundary question, the differentiation question that you struggle with in your relationships? And on the basis of that, I will know in which direction we work. For some of us, it's about more transparency. And for some of us, it's actually about less transparency. There's never just one answer on this one. Remember, most of us come out of our childhoods either wanting more of something that we didn't have, or wanting less of something that we had too much of. So that's how I would play the dance between vulnerability and transparency. April, what is important to keep in mind when inviting vulnerability from someone who has experienced sexual trauma or attachment related trauma? So what you want to understand is did they experience the trauma in such a way that they decided it's not safe to expose, or that they were so at the response of what the other people wanted from them. They so focused on their attachment that they don't even know what they would expose and what they think, feel, need, want. It depends on how did your partner choose to not choose, how did what protection system did they put in place, what is the way that they cope with the consequences of the trauma, right? The trauma is never an event. The trauma is when we experience certain events in isolation without the empathic response from others, says Peter Levine. So what was the response that they got? They didn't get the empathic response. What kind of response did they get? Neglect or reactivity? These are the too little and too much, right? And on the basis of that, you will know what you want to tell your partner. I know that you barely, if I ask you what do you want to eat, you tell me whatever you want. That's just a simple thing. What would you like? What actually pleases you? What would make you feel good? What would you enjoy today? To go simple. For some people it's about that, and you think there's nothing vulnerable about saying what you want to eat, but for some people that's the beginning of identifying the relationship between self and other. Some people give up themselves too quickly. Whatever you want, whatever you think, whatever you say. And others insist because they have decided that they will never again give themselves up like that. So some people want to learn to be more in control, and other people want to learn to relinquish the control in order to experience the closeness, the connection, and the intimacy. Depending on which one your partner is, you will know what you should keep in mind. So you want to know their story. How did this come to be? What are the things that shaped them, that make them be this way now? And to what extent is this at play with you? What do they project onto you? What fears do they bring with them? And how can you reassure them or make the space for them to discover that which they don't know yet? So that's in a nutshell, April. You know. Elena, if our partner says no to an invitation, can I ask why, so I can understand why their needs for space? So nice. Listen, you can always ask why. And honestly, some people know and some people don't know. They'll just say, I'm different from you. That's not the way I am. I don't talk about things. I figure things out by myself. I mean, the issue is not that. The question I have for you is not, can you ask why? The question I have for you is, will you accept the answer you get, or will you use it to try to argue with it because you don't like it, because it doesn't suit you, because it's not like you? And I'm not saying this to you specifically, Elena. I think this is for many of us what we are likely to do. So whenever we ask a question, my question to the question is always, what will you do with the answer? What are the consequences of knowing? Or will you just say, thank you for telling me, that's important for me to know, I appreciate that, and leave it at that for the first time at least? Yes. Ellie, how do you find a balance between opening up too much and putting up your walls to protect yourself, especially at the start of a relationship when it's a trial phase? Listen, you do not know. This is why the start of a relationship is filled with intense insecurity and intense excitement. You don't know. You try, you put something out, and you see the response you get. And suddenly you realize if that actually opened up a whole new pan of closeness, a whole new landscape of shared experiences, or if you shared something and the person just sat there. Yeah. And for some of us, the yeah, with a face that is warm, looks at us, smiles, holds us, feels you get it. And for some of us, that's like, it's all you have to say. It's like, I need something more. So what do we say? Have you ever experienced something like that? Have you ever been in that kind of a situation? We invite reciprocity. We want to experience a sense of mutuality so that we don't feel alone with this. Because that's the threat of the vulnerability, right? Is that I open myself, I share those things with you, and I'm standing out there alone in the cold. So in the beginning of a relationship, I can't give you the certainty that you want, because the essence of a beginning of a relationship is uncertainty. So what you do it a little bit, you check, you see, you watch how the other person does it. And if you are on the slower side, you're on the slower side. There's so many ways that we can open ourselves up and share of ourselves. you know at what point do I tell a person that I'm on SSRIs? At what time do I tell a person I have herpes? At what time do I tell a person about sexual trauma? At what time? When do I reveal these things? There is no when. There's a certain set of feelings, a back and forth cues you get, a sense that this is a safe place, that it's worth to take the risk, that you really need to know, because the kind of response you will get will tell you about how you're going to continue. It's those steps: step, response, observe, do the next step, that kind of thing, that tells us how we will proceed in the process of disclosure of our vulnerabilities to a partner, to a new person. Yes. How can we bounce back from not getting back the expected response, I love you too? Ooh, yes, 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 yes. You know, it's a great question. I say I love you, and then it depends. Sometimes the person suddenly squeezes our hand more, or holds our face and looks in our eyes, and does, or just receives it, or isn't there yet. And that doesn't mean they don't feel it yet. It sometimes means they want to be able to say it freely on their own time, when it comes up for them, and not just as a response or as a way to reassure us. So sometimes it's about, this is a tough one to say and not get an answer. I hope it's cooking inside of you. It's um, it's difficult to say those things and not get an answer, but I understand that you're going to need to say this on your own time, if you do. Or shall I take it back? Was that too soon? Does that put pressure on you if I say I love you? It's so many things that get played out when one person says the first I love you to another person. And it is vulnerable. Love is vulnerable. Nothing I will say is going to make it go away. It's just going to make it more normal, more accepted, more integrated into the full experience of our human condition. I think that this is it. We are coming to an end of our conversation today. So, again, join me, push all the buttons, register, subscribe, stay in touch, and let's continue the many, many conversations about relationships, relational intelligence. See you soon.